Katie from Nerd Church here. I am on the former Millionaires Row of Mesa, Arizona. I started off at the Corey house. I am still walking around the corner to the back of the property, which is actually on the other street. Because Tony Corey, who, just briefly, he was an immigrant from Lebanon because in the first half of the 20th century, the political situation was incredibly unstable, and basically a whole generation of young men just picked up sticks and left. They ended up all over the place. A bunch of them actually ended up in Iowa, where my people were from, hilariously enough. But there were a couple of prominent families that emerge out of that in Arizona. Now, the Bashas you've probably heard of because they had a grocery store chain that's still in business, still owned by the family, still doing well. The Coreys went into auto dealerships, and some of them still own auto dealerships, and then a lot of them became doctors. Okay, so the Coreys, they come in from the Bashas. They come in through Mexico into the U.S., and they're Catholic. Now, they aren't Roman Catholic, they're Maronite Catholic. But there just weren't enough Maronites at that time to start their own church. So the very earliest arrivals tended to become Roman Catholic. It also didn't hurt that there were not a lot of women that came with this migration. So you sort of ended up with a situation where you had young men with good jobs. They were ambitious, they were pleasant, they were all these kinds of things. But bringing a wife over was going to be hard. And there were a lot of Mexican and Mexican-American women who were, beautiful, smart, funny, good cooks, everything that a man, pious, virtuous, had a good family. All of the things that a young man in that time and place was taught that he should look for in a wife. And so they got married, and they got married to Mexican women. So that created a really interesting phenomena where you had some women and you had some families that were Hispanic and Catholic, but they were also partly Arab. And because there had been a long history of Irish immigration, relating to, things like the various mineral rushes, the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, all that kind of thing. You basically ended up with a situation where LDS people, they knew how to, they had mental space for Catholics. So as long as Mr. and Mrs. Corey leaned in to their Catholic identity, they had a place. They were able to make a place and make themselves understood and make themselves comprehensible without, and this is incredibly important, they were not required to assimilate. They were allowed to remain separate and distinct as long as they could, behave as polite people and make people welcome and extend appropriate hospitality, and were willing to accept appropriate hospitality from other people. And as long as they did that, yes, of course they assimilated, because, people become like the people they go to school with. That's the other thing. There weren't necessarily Catholic schools around here, or if they were small. What does that mean? What that means is that you had Latine, primarily Mexican kids, and white, primarily LDS kids, who were all going to school together and got to know each other. But now, of course, you're saying, okay, That happens everywhere. That's not a big deal. That doesn't get rid of prejudice. No, that does not get rid of prejudice. I'm going to show you what gets rid of, what helps to undermine prejudice, right? And so what I'm talking about right here is the price of admission. Okay, so I have gotten all the way around the corner, and now I am standing under this lovely fig tree because Tony Corey came from Lebanon, and when he had his own house, he wanted to have his own vine and his own fig tree, and he did. His house had a double city lot. This property is huge. It's almost an acre. And he had a very large gate installed on the back of this property. Here's the gate. Now, why did he do that? Was it because he had a boat? No, like I said, he was a car dealer. We're talking about this, the Corey house was built in, I don't recall the precise date off the top of my head. I believe it was built in 1950. It may have actually been built in, between 1946 and 1950. I would have to look up the property records to come correct on that date. So just, we're talking late 40s, early 50s. That's when this house gets built. So why is there a big gate? He was a car dealer. This is the 1950s, and he had a Ford dealership. Think about, okay, we're talking about the era of the pink Cadillac, right? Like, literally, this is when Ford is making cars that people are going to write songs and write poetry about, right? So naturally, he would have a party every year. And in the backyard of his house, he would put all of the brand new Fords, that whole model year. There would be samples out in his backyard for the great and good of the city to look at. But there was a price for admission. And what was the price for admission? Simple. You had to come to the party. You had to walk in 1955 and 1960 and 1965. If you lived in Mesa, Arizona, and you wanted to come to one of the social events of the season, you had to walk in the front door of the house of a Lebanese Catholic where alcohol was being served. They had punch. It was non-alcoholic. And believe me, a punch cup is a really good way if you're an LDS man to show that you are not drinking alcohol, because why else would a man be carrying a pink punch cup? So they would have punch. They had alcohol. There was a full wet bar. And you had to walk into that house and you had to shake hands with Tony Corey, who was a very nice man and very good at shaking hands. And you had to say, "Thank you for inviting me, Mr. Corey." And then, if he didn't know your wife, you introduced your wife to him and to his wife. And then you shook hands with Mrs. Corey, if you didn't know her already. And you said, "Thank you again for inviting us, Mrs. Corey. You have such a lovely home." And then for the next hour or 2 hours, you had to conduct yourself as a guest in the Corey home. And if you shamed yourself either in front of your community or by being unable to function in a normal social circumstance in a way that would get you invited back to next year's party, you would be invited back. If you couldn't cut that, if you couldn't rise up to that basic level, can I function in a cocktail party? You didn't get invited back, and probably everybody found out why. Now, was Tony Corey out there marching, protesting? Would he have even thought of himself as a civil rights activist? No, of course not. Why? Because he was a car salesman. He would sell a car to anyone who walked on his lot with enough money. But again, he would sell a car to anyone who walked on his lot with enough money. He didn't care. He would invite you to his house. He didn't care. But there were standards of behavior that you were expected to hold to. And if you want to know why Arizona is weird and Mesa is weird, and like, I will sometimes talk about my lived experience in a way that people are like, that does not sound like a red state. That's why. We were a red state, but we were different. And part of the reason why we were different is because here the price of admission was tolerance.